Hey, good morning, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Unlocked Show. I'm your host, Tracy Wilson. It's my pleasure to be here with you guys today. It is the very last show of the year for The Unlocked Show. So firstly, I want to wish everybody a very Merry Christmas and to thank you all very much for tuning in to The Unlocked Show over the last year. And I think today we are up to over 200 episodes of The Unlocked Show. And today's guest is a very, very special guest. He comes all the way from California in the USA. He's Dr. Douglas Garland. He's a practice orthopedic surgeon of over 37 years in the Southern California area. And Dr. Garland was also a clinical professor of orthopedics at the University of Southern California, where he actually authored over 100 peer-reviewed scientific articles with over 600 citations. Now, the tall poppy syndrome is something that if you're from New Zealand or Australia, like I am, born in New Zealand, moved to Australia, very, very aware of the tall poppy syndrome. It's something that we talk about, I would say, fairly regularly. But for somebody in America, not so much. So really, really interestingly, some years ago, Dr. Garland started to really research this concept of tall poppy syndrome after experiencing some of it himself. He was wondering, what the heck is this? And funnily enough, he heard that term from an Australian, one of his Australian counterparts and professionals that he dealt with said to him, hey, I think you may have been tall poppied. And in his, at the time, he was like, what the heck is that? What is tall poppied? Which sent him down a bit of a path of researching. And I won't say just a bit of a path, a huge path. He delved deep into the archives of this concept of tall poppy syndrome. And today we want to talk about, what is that? Why is it so prevalent? Why is it actually, all over the world? And I'm really interested to find out, why is it so prevalent in the likes of Australia and New Zealand? And after speaking with him behind the scenes, wasn't so much in America until, I'm going to say, until recent times. So I want to welcome him to the show. It's fantastic to have you here. I'm sure that loads and loads of people are really interested, particularly if you're from Australia and New Zealand, or maybe some smaller countries that are very familiar with this concept of tall poppy syndrome, are going to want to know more about it. What is it? Where did it actually come from? And why do we experience it? And how does it actually impact our ability to be successful? Welcome to the show. It's fantastic to have you here.
It's my pleasure, Tracy. This is kind of a completion of the circle for me, since I was introduced to the syndrome somewhere between 10 and 15 years ago by an Australian colleague. And I have spent 8 years studying it, 1 year pretty much in a library, although most medical libraries are now all virtual. Although because of my past history, I was more comfortable sitting in a library. I still went to the library, just like going to work, and just sit in front of a computer at the library instead of at home. And I think it makes, if you're in the writing system, you have to do the same thing over and over. So I was used to that. That put me in the right mood to do my basic research. The basic research came from Australia. There's a couple really prominent authors, Peters and Flower, and of the English-speaking countries, New Zealand and Australia are the most recognized for having the tall poppy syndrome. So mostly the first year of my research involved researching the literature, which mostly came from Australia. There is some from New Zealand, but just by size, there's going to be more authors and more chances for the tall poppy syndrome in Australia. And for your listeners, most of you probably know, Australia was a penal colony of England, and that's how the country sort of was founded. And if you're in the penal system, then there's no place that's more prevalent than the tall poppy syndrome than in the prison, because if somebody has a toothbrush and the next 10 people don't, you're taking your life in your own hands, because everybody are supposed to be equal. So that original culture has permeated your society from the very beginning, and that's why it's there. And in the end, that's why I thought maybe it wasn't in America, because after I did my basic research, then I did what we call an observational study. I took the New York Times, the LA Times, Time Magazine, the Wall Street Journals, various periodicals, and I looked every day to see if I could find evidence of the tall pot. Once I understood it from your studies, to see if I could find it in America. And actually, I did find it every day in America, but I'm going to go through this observational study, and the study set up the tall poppy syndrome is based on emotional behaviors, the emotional behaviors of the cutter and the emotional behaviors of the tall poppy. So I break that down very differently than the way it was broken down in Australia. That was one of my first differences. And the premise of the book was it's unrecognized in our country. And I felt that maybe it was because of our individualism. Our country was founded completely different than your country. So I thought that our culture of the individualist maybe was the difference and why we don't have it here, that we worship. Well, we used to worship the individual. I can't say in America we worship the individual. The individual and the rugged individuals of the American West is kind of a no-no now. We don't, you can't say somebody, I'm an individualist and I'm rugged, or you're going to be cut down by the cancel culture that we have now. But anyway, that was the premise. By the time I was done researching the book, I had to conclude that I felt that the tall poppy syndrome was more prevalent in America than in the rest of the countries because of our individualism and because of our meritocracy at work, our meritocracy in schools, the way that we compete. And, all the ism countries, for example, communism, there's no competing. The Nordic countries, there's no competing. So we're a very aggressive race. I mean, we're always at war, I have to say, which is part of our aggression. So at the conclusion of the book, I felt that the tall poppy syndrome was actually more prevalent in America, but just unrecognized.
Interesting.
And it's because of our meritocracy and the way we're always trying to get ahead. And if we move into a neighborhood, we always want, first of all, the American dream is to buy your home. Once you buy your home, you're almost never satisfied. You're already starting to take the equity out of that home and move into a new neighborhood. So we never, our country is of abundance, and we never seem to have enough. So we just can never be satisfied and be happy with who we are. We have to keep on the move. And that drives the tall poppy syndrome. The next thing that I had to resolve was, and it's in your countries too, but you don't look at it like I look at it. I broke the tall poppy syndrome down into peer to peer and the public. And the reason peer to peer is so important is because that's where the tall poppy syndrome originates. It's your tribe. And most of the people that are cut down are tall poppies. So it happens in your family, first and foremost, at the very beginning of your life. I grew up in a small farm town in central Iowa, which is our Midwest. Big farm families back then, 7 kids was nothing because you have to help on the farm. My mother, however she did things, kept everybody equal. So we only had one birthday, like when you became 10 years of age, and you only got $50 spent on your birthday party and 10 friends could come. So that standard was held to everybody else so that there was no favoritism in our family. And in America, I grew up in the 50s. So when I went to school, we were in the Sputnik race with Russia at that time in the 50s, of course, 62, putting a man on the moon with Kennedy and stuff. But our schools were so aggressive at that time of science and math and getting ahead and patriotism and climbing above everybody else and getting ready to fight the Cold War. So that has also gone away from our system now. Now we don't even have valedictorians, and everybody gets a trophy. So the smart people in our schools get cut down by the teachers because they want everybody to be equal. We have a movement here
Mm,
now to go to charter schools, to get out of the public school system and to get into the parochial or Christian school system, or what we call charter schools, where you can let the smart advance as rapidly as they can. But in many public schools, that's very difficult. So our students are being cut down. And then you go into the workplace or college, competition to get into college. Now we're cutting people down. We don't have admission tests. We want to check more boxes than have people on merit. So we have, race as part of it, how you grow up is part of it. But we have all these boxes instead of a meritocracy in the individual. We're checking other things, cutting down people as we go. And then, of course, in our workplace, you're always crawling up the ladder of success. So you're in competition with the person next to you to get the next
mm,
promotion. And, it's very hard to improve yourself. It's very easy to cut somebody down. So human nature is human nature. What do? We don't try to improve ourselves. We try and cut the next person down.
mm.
And so
I,
that's prevalent in our workplace. And then, of course, we have the true tall poppies, the people that have made it and are well known, highly regarded, our Hollywood industry, our media industry, our professional athletes, and worst of all, politicians. And
mm.
politics rules the world. So that's how I broke it down: peer to peer versus public figures. And
I
it's
find
most prevalent in peer to peer, but we don't hear about it.
I find this is really an interesting thing because as you and I were talking about this before we went live, and I was telling you that I'm originally from New Zealand and have moved to Australia about 18 years ago. And tall poppy syndrome, I mean, I've known of that term since I was a young girl. It's a term thrown around all the time, and something that, and you alluded to this, you said, about this whole tribal aspect of, you don't want people to be moving outside of the norms of the tribe or the norms of that society. And as soon as you do, it's almost as if there's like this magnet force that, to draw that person back in, so that we're all equal, we're all the same, and nobody's able to, no, it's not seen to be good. So, from a negative standpoint, not seen to be good to be standing out from the crowd, to be looking different from any of those others within your tribal circles. And I know we're going to get to this, where we're talking about sort of that whole peer-to-peer, and where this tall poppy syndrome starts to fester and bubble itself up, and we then start to see that sort of ripple out from our family to other parts of society. But quite interesting that you would speak about how, when you went back in history, that you saw this in the likes of Australia and New Zealand and some of these other smaller European countries. And then in America, didn't see it so much, it was there, but it was almost as if it was sitting beneath the surface and not really spoken about. It's quite interesting for somebody, grew up in New Zealand, now lives in Australia, but has lots of American friends, lots of American associates, and I do a lot of business in America. And it's really interesting to me to see those cultural differences in terms of this whole tall poppy syndrome. So it's quite fascinating. So, and interesting to me that you would move from the type of work that you were doing as an orthopedic surgeon, and doing working on people at that on their spinal injuries and what have you, and being very, I'm going to say, well known or very well respected in your industry, to then sort of step away from that and really after a conversation with somebody else from another country and going, hey, that's happened to you. You didn't really know or understand that this whole tall poppied situation was actually happening to you. It was even a thing. Then started to delve down that path to really start to understand it. And the interesting thing, I think, is when you, in the studies that you've done, when you've gone back and you've looked at the history of why is this actually the case, and for it to stem from, you know, the fact that Australia, for example, is you know, we would say in Australia, and this is no secret, you know, we were convict country. You know, a lot of people were sent here because they were convicts, and that whole penal system of, you know, you don't want to have that toothbrush or that bar of soap and be the only one that has that, because that's not a good thing. You know, you need to get rid of that or share it amongst the rest, because you want everybody to be equal and everybody to be otherwise they're not happy. You create this imbalance, if you will, in the societal structure. And I think that's and maybe that's where the I'm interested to know, you know, from a, I suppose, an emotional or a balance standpoint, is that you know, something that has been tried to, when you're pulling somebody back in who's maybe standing out or being the tall poppy and you're wanting to cut them down, has that all been stemmed from trying to get balance or trying to get order back into a particular society?
Well, that's what happens, because if the guy has the toothbrush, first of all, he knows that he's special, and so what's he going to do? He's going to hide it. I mean, so now
Mm,
he's like Adam and Eve. They committed a sin, and what do? They hide from God and put the figs on them. So
yeah.
so the first thing, you already have a moral decision, even though you're in a prison, and who knows if they have morals, but they know something's wrong here. So they have
Mm,
to go into a different mode of behavior. And that mode of behavior is already picked up by the other people. So everybody in the system knows something's going on here. This guy's hiding something. What's he doing over there? What's he got that I don't have? And so it's just set up from that. As I mentioned, it's all emotions. So
and
that
so
that's
therefore you
brought it in, and it's the proximity, as I mentioned, why I think it may seem more prevalent in New Zealand to you than Australia. Is probably not, but it's the closeness and the smallness. So my small town, I knew everybody. Everybody knew who I was. So if I did something that I shouldn't do, then they either told me about it or told my dad, and then my dad told me. So I was always being cut down, rightly or wrongly. So what do? I go from a town of 400 to an area of 20 million, so that I would be somewhere where nobody knew me and I could be my own
mm,
man. And it'd be harder for me to be cut down. And so that's kind of how, I don't want to say small mindedness, but because that'll turn some people off. But sometimes the smaller communities are small minded and they're very envious. And this is what drives the tall poppy syndrome in the peer to peer is envy. Envy is broken
mm,
down into positive and negative, or good and bad. Aristotle started that way back in ancient Greece. And good envy is the way life should be, and life is not the way it should be. And that, I have to say, I had very good parents, very good upbringing. I'm a small guy, I never had a mean bone in my body, but I mean, I came from a very rural community. I made it into medical school, I made it into my residency, I made it into a, a really good practice in Los Angeles. I, became a very academic guy. How did I do it? I emulated. I wasn't intrinsically smart. I had a very bad background. I had really, I don't like to say it, but my mother hardly knew the difference between a noun and a verb. I mean, I come from a very basic place in life. And how did I do that? I was able to always align myself with good people and study their
mm,
habits. So if you want to learn tennis, you don't want to go with the worst player in the world. You're not going to get any better. You got to go with the best player in the world to improve yourself. So that's the importance of the tall poppy. And that's why people should never forget that society doesn't move, forward unless there's tall poppies. So tall poppies,
Mm.
what I used to think happened in America were worship, and even our Elon Musk now, who I think is our tallest poppy in America, is actively being cut down uh, because of the way he's trying to change Twitter around. But the perception of he's changing, and these perceptions are made by value judgments by the public. And in my instance, I think their value judgments are wrong, but we're hopefully going to go into that. So anyway, bad
Mm.
envy then is all these people seeing the tall poppy. They don't want me to leave town. They cut me down. They tell me I'm no good. They try to destroy my self-esteem, so I'll stay within my tribe. So it's that bad envy that is number one and by far the most important bad emotion in the cutter in the tall poppy syndrome, peer to peer. The other two are anger. You get angry at somebody who has something more than you do, like in the prison state, and you act out against them. You try and destroy their happiness. You try and destroy what they have. So anger actually, all emotions have positive and negative aspects. The good thing of anger is it's supposed to focus your attention. So I say, if you're a ball player and somebody dribbles around you, rather than tripping them um, or fouling them, you should do focus your training and get your footwork better. That's good anger as opposed to the bad anger. And then the third thing is laziness. People just
Mm.
don't want to do the work. And I don't want to say everybody's lazy, but it is easier to be lazier than get up first thing in the morning and work till the sun goes down. So those three negative emotions, negative aspects of emotions drive the peer-to-peer cutter in the tall poppy syndrome. And once again, in this group of people, you don't have to be, you're not cutting down necessarily somebody tall, just somebody in a certain extent that is really different rather than tall.
Mm.
And then when I looked at
And
the,
we're saying we often see that sort of thing in the family unit, yeah? So it
yes,
sort of
so it starts,
it starts there.
it absolutely starts in the family. Um, and parents are trying to do the right thing. And I mean, look at good families sometimes have bad children. Some things just don't work out. But, most of the time, I think parents are trying to do things. But I mean, I like to study the Bible. The Bible is full of the tall poppy syndrome. We're in Genesis 3 and we have Adam and Eve, and Eve is prideful and gets cut down by God for taking the forbidden fruit. She blames. We're already in the blame game, which is the world right
Mm.
now, where she blames the devil and she coaxes Adam into it, and then Adam blames her, but they both fall. But so we're in the third chapter, and already God has done essentially the tall poppy syndrome. But let's go into the fourth chapter of Genesis. Here we are, the first thing in the Bible, and we have Cain and Abel. And Cain kills Abel because God liked Abel's offering. So here we have familial envy right away in the Bible, and of course Joseph and his 12 and his 11 brothers later on in Genesis, and so we in the Bible itself early on we see familial envy. So trust me, it's
Mm.
very prevalent in the family, not necessarily toxic, but I think families should be aware of it. And once you in medicine we say you have before you can cure anything you have to make a diagnosis. So part of the
Mhm.
thing I want to talk about is so people look at the lens of the tall poppy syndrome, how I look at it, and that's the first thing to curing it. And that cures your own as you're looking outside the window or through the window, you then should reflect and you look at your own value judgment on how you're looking at something. So we'll go into that. I want to do so I'll just do it now. So in America, here's a good example. of all this that we're talking about. Most people know about Will Smith and sort of the slap heard around the world during our Academy Award ceremony against Chris Rock when he made what some felt was a derogatory remark about Will's wife, which actually I think Will Smith was trying to make it positive because Demi Moore was originally, there was a takeoff on Demi Moore when she shaved her head, and she
Mm-hmm.
became very famous for having the nerve to do that. And
Mm-hmm.
she was on all kinds of magazines, and it was a big step forward. So I actually thought it was a compliment, but some people took it wrong. But here's Will Smith tried to cut down um, Chris Rock, peer to
Mm-hmm.
peer. They're both tall poppies in the end, peer to peer. So we couldn't, you and I probably couldn't cut either one of those down, but those two could cut each other down. Will Smith, because of pride, pride is the most common, egregious emotion in the tall poppy. That'll cut you down every time. The Prime Minister of England just was cut down mostly because of his hubris or pridefulness,
Mm-hmm.
eating in his, with COVID going on, nobody could eat together, but of course he's eating together. So Will Smith, because of his prideful behavior, which turned into anger, because he originally laughed and then he became angry because his wife was angry, went on stage and slapped her. That was person to person, peer to peer. And now it turned into a public because it was on TV.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have a completely different take on the emotions involved and the justification. And the justification becomes, unfortunately, on your own value judgment. And that's how some people thought it was okay for uh, that Chris Rock deserved to be slapped because they identified with the negative aspect, which, once again, I thought it was a positive compliment that he was saying about Will Smith's wife. But most of the public, because in the end, we'll talk about it, but virtues are the foundation of moral justice and righteous indignation. And most people get that. And so most of the public felt Will Smith was wrong, which included Disney, which canceled his next movie contract. The Academy condemned him. He can't be a member for 10 years. So the public felt justified in cutting Will Smith down because of his egregious behavior. And the other two main bad emotions in the tall poppy are lust and, especially in America, greed. So you have three what I call deadly sins: greed, lust, pride in the tall poppy, and in the cutter you have envy, anger, and laziness. And guess what? That's 6 of the 7 so-called deadly sins. The only
Mm-hmm.
deadly sin that's not in the tall poppy syndrome is laziness. So the value for your listeners is this gives you a handbook of how to look at the tall poppy syndrome as I look at it, through peer to peer, through public, through the cutter's behavior, through the um, tall poppy's behavior, if it is public and there's a true tall poppy involved. And then you can make a value judgment on it and kind of decide who you think's right and who is wrong. Now, the value of the value judgment comes in, everything is about mindfulness now. But
Mm-hmm.
the value judgment then brings mindfulness into play and to cognizant distancing. So now we're going to evaluate it. And during this evaluation process, you're going to bring yourself into play and evaluate how this all transpired. And that's hopefully how you as a person grows through understanding the tall poppy syndrome, because you should be able to understand your own behavioral patterns. You don't know you're a bully unless somebody calls you out. So by looking at this, trust me, I grew so much emotionally as I did this study and worked through all these problems. But my wife already knew about it. That's why she told me to resign my position. Um, and she knew what the emotions that I was going to go through, and they were going to be the bad emotions. I wasn't going to grow. I wasn't going to
Mm-hmm.
try and improve myself. I was going to take the easy way out. I was going to seek. I was going to get angry. I was going to seek revenge. I was going to try and figure out who cut me down. So she did my cognizant distancing for me. She allowed me to step back and look at the situation and figure out the best course for me is to resign and do something differently instead of going seeking revenge or going negative, which is how politicians do everything. Politicians
Mm-hmm.
almost always go negative, and that is the wrong path to go. So so anger and then revenge, which is what Will Smith says, and we have a couple. I have a couple of sayings I like about revenge. Revenge is best served cold, which is what my wife was able to make me do, um, which was distance myself from just what had transpired to me and really reflect on what was going on. And the other thing I like about revenge is if you seek revenge, dig two graves, because the revenger almost ends up worse off than the person he sought revenge on. Why? Because
Mm-hmm.
his behavior has to be worse in order for him to win. And who won in the Chris Rock, Will Smith um, duel? Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Chris Rock won.
Chris Rock. Mm-hmm.
The he won. I mean, the grave that Will Smith dug for himself was 10 times deeper than Chris Rock's.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how understanding the tall poppy syndrome, and if you get tall poppy, how it works. And if you get tall poppy, about 50% of the people actually improve from it. So an example here in America would be Steve Apple. Steve
Mm-hmm.
Apple was a terrible person his first 10 or 20 years running Apple. He had a very sociopathic personality, which most of our tech engineers have in the Silicon Valley. They're all cut from that same cloth. And he was fired from that position by the board. And so he was tall poppy, public and peer to peer. And he grew from that episode. So just because you get tall poppy does not mean that's the end of the world, and it's a time for reflection, and as hopefully you can grow. And trust me, Steve Jobs grew immensely during that time he was away from
Mm-hmm.
Apple. He founded two new companies. One was Pixar, which is just a fantastic company. The other one was Next, I think, and he was CEO of that, and they brought him over. It was a package deal. Apple bought Next, and Steve was the CEO of Next, so he became again CEO of Apple and took it to the largest capitalized country or company in the world. So trust me, he grew a lot from his being tall poppy, but he definitely had bad, egregious behavior. And through deservingness, I think the board was right in cutting him down. And they were lucky that they ended up with him again. I think it was not luck they cut him down, but the whole circle I find fascinating. Just like the Will Smith example that I gave you was fascinating. How things turn out in the tall poppy syndrome. So we're probably getting shorter on time, but so my study actually started how the tall poppy syndrome was described, and it's important. It's actually described in Greece by Herodotus, who is a great Greek historian. But I actually like Livy, who was the uh, Roman historian. You have to remember that um, Rome was burned. There wasn't a lot of history of Rome for Livy to read on, like I did studying this, because all the libraries were closed. So what he did, he just took Greek examples, and he knew that personalities and emotions stayed the same, which I also know now too. That's why I could look through all the country and
Mm-hmm.
see the tall poppy syndrome everywhere. Once I understood people's behaviors, and people don't change. Caesar would be the same if Caesar was in his generation 2,000 years ago, or if he was a Steve Jobs or an Elon Musk today. Those, your emotions, your emotional makeup, you can modify them, and your mind can change and you can control them, but that makeup stays the same. So Livy knew that. I think he just took the Greek explanation or description of the tall poppy syndrome. Greeks actually used uh, heads of wheat, and Livy changed it to the true tall poppy. So the Rome was originally kingdoms, and the seventh king, the last king, Tarquin the Proud, and here you are. Here's the guy with the
Mm-hmm.
name of the Proud. You can tell he's going to get kicked off the throne. Tarquin the Proud himself gets cut down, but his son was running the town next to him. Was having Sextus was running Gabii, the town, and he was having trouble ruling it. So he sent a messenger back to his father. What do I need to do to make me gain control of the town? And his father went out to poppy field, lopped off the tall heads. The messenger goes back and tells Sextus, and Sextus kills all the founders or the opposition. And we see this. So the tall poppy syndrome was described in government. And in my study, I feel governments throughout the world have been the biggest cutters in the tall poppy syndrome.
Mm.
And our own government here in America is, I think, the biggest cutter of tall poppies in America. We have all these agencies. The agencies frequently do the dirty work. I just tweeted out today, Lee, who was the owner of the newspaper in Hong Kong, the Chinese government just sentenced him for 5 to 6 years in jail because he was an opposition leader to the takeover of Hong Kong. So I still do that observational study. I still take the periodicals, and when I see an example worldwide of tall poppy syndrome, I tweet it out and who I think's at fault, whether it's the tall poppy or the cutter, or what's the behavior going on in this example. But anyway, I started with ancient Greece and in ancient Rome. Caesar was tall poppied. Socrates drank the hemlock. He was tall poppied. So I was able to find tall poppy syndrome in Japan. The first emperor of China was a terrible ruler. He tall poppied everybody. Genghis Khan was a terrible ruler. He tall poppied everybody. Communism and all over the world tall poppies everybody. The Nordic countries have, which we discussed at the start of the show, the law of Jante, Jante. It's 10 ways on how to not grow tall.
Mm.
So they do it in a reverse way. They do it passively rather than actively. They try and teach the young people not to become a tall poppy and not to stick out. So I found it in all cultures. Different cultures have different terms, different metaphors for it, but in all periods of time. And I mean, this is another good point for your listeners. England, for example, in the mid-centuries was always a war with England and France. The two of them were always warring was who's going to be the leader. They're always cutting the countries are cutting each other's down. The kings are cutting each other down. Queens are cutting each other's down. So this is the concept I want to bring about now. And in Buddhism, they have near and far enemies, which is a wonderful concept in the tall poppy syndrome. In England, the far enemy would be France. Everybody knows France is the enemy. The problem with all the kingdoms and in the families and in the peer-to-peer and in the prison system, it's the near enemies that you don't know are going to cut you down, who cut you down. And remember, we talked about the righteous indignation as justifying cutting people down. But the enemy of righteous indignation is self-righteousness. And I can guarantee you Australia is full of self-righteousness. New Zealand is full of self-righteousness. America and its cancel culture is full of self-righteousness. Our politicians are full of self-righteousness. So here's the near enemy, and these people don't understand their behavior. They're cutting all the peer-to-peer people down and don't appreciate their behavior and what they're doing.
Mm.
And so that concept is very important in the tall poppy syndrome.
Do you think that, with talking about this cancel culture too, being very prevalent in society right now, and do you think that where we're going is an improvement on where we've been in terms of tall poppy and this cancel society, or are we, creating something that's worse than where we've been?
Well, I think my opinion is it's worse. Everybody will, I mean, this is going to be a conflict, and wherever you have conflict, we're going to have the tall poppy syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I just like to take Rockefeller, who founded Standard Oil, the first oil field, and oil changed the world. And I have to tell you, I think oil changed the world for the better. It improved the standard of living through the entire universe. So it's only 100 years later, we found out there's a lot of CO2, and it's probably one of the causes of climate change. So does that give us the right to cut down John Rockefeller, because he started the oil company, which is what's happening here in America?
Mm.
We're taking his statues down. Absolutely not. I still worship the guy. He's a wonderful guy. He did a wonderful thing for the world. He married America, a preeminent country. And I think the balance of good and bad, America has been good for the world. And we certainly couldn't have done that without oil, and oil here in our own country. So the balance of goodness, I think, outweighs the evil. We just have to do the correction. I mean, all of life is a correction. No, life doesn't go in a straight line. I mean, my life, there was no straightness at all in my life. I mean, I lived in 10 different
Mine
states.
neither.
Right, I just bounced around. So life is about change, and we frequently overcorrect when we change, but life is a balance, and to move forward, you can't continue to always move forward. There's always got to be a correction. It's just hope the correction is not overcorrection. And I just think we're so self-righteous now and so self-centered, and it's driven by the internet, that we've completely lost focus. And I lived through the 60s, which was 10 times worse times in America than what we're going through right now. So I'm confident we'll recorrect. But I think all our wokeness and cancel culture is an overcorrection. It needed to happen, and it needs writing. But once
maybe
again,
not to the degree.
now it's just, I mean, it's just too prevalent and too prominent. I mean, good grief. I still worship tall poppies. We put people on pedestals to remind people who are great and to be able to emulate them. That's why.
And to have something to aspire to and people to look up to. Yeah.
Yeah, and people
And if you didn't have that,
people have lost that. They don't even know why we name the school the name we name them. And so they don't even understand who the name is up there now. They're just so concerned about themselves and this self-righteousness that they're right. And the cure for the tall poppy syndrome, which I never saw too much discussion anywhere in the world, to include Australia and New Zealand, is virtue. And that I like ancient Greece and ancient Rome, comes from Stoicism. They believed in virtue, but of course all the Christianity believes in virtue. And if you Google 7 deadly sins, what's going to come up? opposite the deadly sins are virtues. Now, the
Mm,
psychologists don't necessarily believe all that stuff. That's why they have a positive and negative. They don't say emotions are good or bad. I like to. I think that's clean, and I think it's a good way to emphasize. But I'm open to how the world wants to do that. But I talk about good and bad emotions. But I also love. Um, I love the virtues. So my enemy is envy, and the um, the virtue is kindness. So
mm,
if you just think your behavior's bad, then just think of kindness. That's how you control um, bad behavior. And remember, it's your perception, your bias that controls emotion. So I think Will Smith's bias conception was completely wrong, and that's why he went down the wrong path. If he took 5 or took 10 and some deep breaths, he may not have ever done that. So the whole problem of this self-righteousness is that madness in your head that your perception is wrong and they need to step back. I mean, to think that we defunded the police. I mean, we have in our country 400 years is all, but we have 400 years of determination that society's better off with protection. And now we want to defund the police. So that's how the cancel culture
mm.
is wrong in their corrections. Their perception of how they want to right the wrong, I don't think usually follows from A to B. That's my problem with them. But the virtue of pride for the tall poppy is humility. And so if you just think of the bad emotion, the emotion, the dark side of it, and then think of the virtue, that's how you correct. I wrote it.
Mm.
My original book was about a third of it was how to become a tall poppy. And at that time, I looked through the literature and found there were 10,000 self help books annually. And so that,
Wow.
yeah, right, right. So that told me that self help books may be inspirational, and they are because they sell a lot, they're big sellers, but they're not very good at being transformational. So
Mm,
I got out of that business because I knew I wasn't going to transform anybody. But I did have a section of the Tall Poppy Hall of Fame, and my virtue was servitude, and by that I mean you're serving your fellow man, you're serving the environment, whatever you're doing, you're serving the person next to you. It's a form of
mhm.
empathy, kindness, humility, everything rolled into one. So I mean, how can you serve? Well, your boss. I had the best boss in the world before I was tall popular. He was my boss for 30 years. He he never told me what to do once. He knew what I was capable of. He came down to my unit about every 2 months and would sit in on a conference. Afterwards, he would just come up and say, "What do I need to help you? How can I make the service better?" It's not how, you need to do this, you need to do that. He
Yeah.
was never telling me anything. He was helping me. And so, um, I mean, that's the rule for the boss is not to dictate, but to
Mm,
reframe that into want to helping people. And likewise, the helpers should likewise feel obligated to help their boss look good and to help the company look good. If the company's, I mean, that's what esprit de corps is, right? If the company's mission statement is right, people are on board and they want to make the company better. They're serving the company. We're in this
mm,
big thing in America now that our companies are too capitalistic and it's all for profit and only the shareholders get the money and the people that work for them don't get anything. Well, for me, once again, that's the wrong look. They're taking the wrong. So there may be some problem there within the company, but they're going with the wrong self-reflection. It's the mission is not either stated properly and the people aren't on board and doing the right thing. But I think for me, each individual virtue, a virtuous life is the best way to not be a cutter, and it's the best way not to get cut down. But if you serve people, you're going to have a grateful life and a happy life. You can't buy happiness. Happiness just happens. And the best way to happiness is to give your money away, not spend it on yourself, and serve other people, and you'll find happiness.
I love it. Well, it's been a really interesting conversation, and what a fascinating piece of, work that you've been doing to try and understand this and we're going back centuries to understand why does this even, still exist today, but also looking at it from a very different perspective in terms of, being the tall poppy or being the cutter. What do I need to do to actually take away and recognize that I'm either standing in one of those camps, I'm going to say, and what can I do about that? How do I influence my behavior in a different way to course correct, to take away some sort of learning from the experience, so that we can create a culture that actually really does embrace those and encourages people. I want to say, to encourage people to step outside of the norm, to do things different, because as you mentioned today, we need those kinds of people. That's what makes the world a better place. We have the likes of the Steve Jobs and and the Elon Musks and what have you, that actually get us to think differently. And when we can have them, we can aspire to those people, we can start to emulate them, and everybody grows. So I love that. I love that concept, and the fact that we're acknowledging that this concept of tall poppy syndrome actually starts really close to home, and it starts, I'm going to say, in the home, and then ripples its way out into society. And we start to see that, sometimes at the highest of levels, in our governments and in our country heads.
Yeah, I think it's a lot. I mean, all this is good for self-reflection, even for parents. I think it's in schools. It's the law of unintended consequences. I mean, the parents
Mm,
are thinking they're doing a good job and being fair to everybody, but in the end, that's not necessarily the case. So,
yeah.
um, I mean, it's just a wonderful. If you understand the tall poppy syndrome, it'll change your view of your family, your workplace, the world. I mean, here's Putin trying to cut down Zelensky. Russia's trying to cut down Ukraine. I mean, the tall poppy syndrome really is everywhere, unfortunately. But
Mhm.
good can come from it. That's the other good point.
Absolutely. And on that note, if you listening today are interested in learning more about the tall poppy syndrome, um, Doug has actually put together a document that you can go and you can download. What is tall? What is it? What is this? What is tall poppy syndrome? So you can go to what is at tallpoppysyndrome.com/FAQs. It's got some frequently asked questions in there, a little bit more detail about his research. And I'll also say that if you want to get in contact with Dr. Doug, then I would encourage you to do so. So, Doug, where's the best place for our listeners to get in touch with you? What's the best, you have social media, what's the best way for them to reach out?
So there's a comment place on my website, which is Doug Garland, DougGgarland.com. And I'm just opened a new website, which is going to be more interactive, which is tallpoppysyndrome, one word.org.
Well, there you go, guys. So head on over to either of those and you can continue to connect with Dr. Doug and talk more about this tall poppy syndrome and how we can, use it for your success, how you can use that, to your ability and actually be able to embrace everything about yourself to be able to improve the success across your business, your family, and life. So I want to say thank you very much for your time today. It's been really insightful chatting with you and learning more about this tall poppy syndrome that I have been, very well aware of since I was a young girl. It was a terminology that I grew up with. So, it's great to sort of hear this from a different perspective and hear it from somebody whom, grew up in a country that it wasn't so, I'm going to say, prevalent in, but not so aware in, like it is in the likes of New Zealand and Australia. And we've often wondered, why is it that we have such a thing? Why is it that it is so prevalent in our country? So it's really interesting to have that conversation with you. So I want to thank you very much. I want to wish you a very, very Merry Christmas. I hope you and your family have a wonderful time together over the Christmas period. And to all of our viewers, like I mentioned at the beginning of the show, this is the last show for 2022. I am excited to see you guys in 2023. For those of you that have been listening for a little while, 2022 has had some challenges, I'm going to say, some interesting times. And I won't say I'm not happy to see the back of it. I'm quite happy to welcome in 2023, and I know that it's going to be an absolutely fantastic year. So I'm hoping that everybody who's listening today has a wonderful Christmas. I do want to say that, if you're spending time with your family, just really be present, really enjoy those moments, because honestly, if it's your first Christmas with, a newborn that's just come into your family, or you've got some, aging parents, or for that matter, anybody, you just don't know. It might be their last Christmas and your last Christmas with them. So make the most of it, enjoy those times together, and just, I'm going to say, reflect on all of the great things that each and every one of your family members does, and applaud them and put them on pedestals, because far too often people are getting cut down from those pedestals. And just for a day, give everybody the opportunity to really, really shine during that time and just enjoy one another's company. So I hope you guys have enjoyed the season of 2020 of the Unlock Show. I've got some really exciting stuff happening in 2023, which I can't wait to share with you guys. But we'll be back in about the 9th of January, I believe, is the next show of the Unlock Show. I'll be back in 2023. But for now, go and live your life unlocked, because as you guys know, there is just no other way. Thanks very much, and bye for now.